In early 2013, comics colorist Jordi Belair took to Tumblr to post on a recent unnamed convention that demonstrated a distinctive lack of respect and appreciation for her profession by deeming itself, quote, not a colorist thing. Titled, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore, the post consisted of first an admonishment of the anonymous convention, and then an impassioned argument for the value of colorists in the encoding of comics, long underappreciated and bereft of any avenue for profiting off of their work through art sales. Belair went on to discuss the general dismissiveness with which the industry writ large regarded the contributions of colorists, whom she described as the unknown backup singers who make every track awesome. The post ranged from artistic value to cultural cachet and the realities of the political economy of colored comics. Colorists make or break a book, wrote Belair. They create form for figures and their environments, mood, tone, and effects like blurring, flares, glows, color holds, etc. If any of this is done badly or doesn't give clarity to an artist's work, the art fails. In the wake of the post going viral, fans flooded social media with words of support for colorists and questions for publishers of why colorists weren't credited on covers or offered any sorts of royalties. The result of this controversy was the inception of Colorist Appreciation Day, an internet holiday celebrated on January 24th, for which the work of colorists is particularly highlighted in social media and comics news outlets. But the controversy has also led to what appears to be a gradual shift in the culture. We indeed see more colorists credited on the covers of mainstream comics, and the conversation in fan communities does seem to take color into account more often as a matter of policy. As I said, Belair's arguments and the concept of Colorist Appreciation Day speak to the subject from a political economy perspective, addressing issues of royalties, cover credit, and visibility paying forward to more work. This shift makes me think about how comics scholarship can also work on color. I want to see how incorporating color theory into comics criticism can and does help account for impact not only on art, but narrative as well. One of the pieces that really got me thinking about this was an essay by Jim Rugg on how the born digital production processes of contemporary comics lead to shallower, muddier print products, while digital shines. Rugg covered the subject quite well there, including explanations of how paper stock affects reprinting and how adjusting levels of contrast, brightness, and specific colors for print can help to avoid the quality issues that come from physicality's lack of precision. This difference derives from subtractive and additive color models, the former for print, the latter for screen. CMYK, or cyan, magenta, yellow, and key or black, is the color printing process, a subtractive model that takes away brightness from a typically white paper surface. RGB, on the other hand, is what we use in digital color display. RGB, or red, green, blue, is an additive process in which various combinations of these colors are combined to produce a broad array. And digital is ostensibly precise. It'll always display the colors the same way, while print will be affected by all sorts of factors in the printing process, even beyond paper stock. I say ostensibly here because I just don't think it's true. The file might be the same, but electronic display has all sorts of other factors to take into account. How much glare is in the room? Is the monitor LCD, LED, plasma, retina display? What's the brightness set to? Is the screen cracked? All of these can affect the display of electronic colors. Having identical files doesn't guarantee anything on the reader's end. But I'm less interested in versioning and the impacts of digitization here than I am in intentionally different coloring processes, i.e. recoloring. I'm also wondering what happens when we take value judgments out of the equation and examine these issues from a differential media perspective. Differential media is a concept adapted from poetry scholar Marjorie Perloff's concept of differential text production, where text exists in different material forms with no single version being the definitive one. Differential media is just a way of expanding that to all media texts explicitly, rather than solely literary ones. And we can see this framework, the process of differential media, at work quite well when it comes to recoloring. For example, none of these images represent the, quote, original cover for X-Men #1. They're all digital remediations and all variously subtle and overt recolorings. Differential media doesn't take that observation and ask, who cares? It instead asks, how are they differently encoded? and what do we uniquely decode from each of them? Stuart Hall distinguishes a negotiated version of an object of study, where both a widely accepted viewpoint and a more nuanced and exceptional exploration can coexist. In encoding and decoding, we're offered a view of cultural production in which producers and users complete a circuit, and the act of reception is just as much a productive practice as that of production or dissemination. This, to me, begins to offer a roadmap to understanding recoloring. However, this starts getting confusing when we try to hold in our minds that basically everything on the printed page is subtracted, even if it was designed using an additive color process on a screen, as a presumptive majority of the comics produced today are. Similarly, everything digitized is displayed using an additive coloring process, so it's difficult to discuss differential materiality in a purely digital context. Regardless, we can take more language from color theory to usefully parse recoloring processes wherever the production takes place and wherever the product is subsequently displayed. Edith Feisner writes about local color, optical color, and arbitrary color. Local color is when the colors are represented as they are in white daylight without lighting changing the tonal value. They're colors as we expect them to be. For example, a red barn, a blue sky, green grass. We can say that these colors are idealistic and that they show colors as the perfect ideal or in their simplest form. Optical color is when lighting conditions are taken into consideration. These would include shadows, and the area in which an image is suited would be rendered naturalistic rather than idealistic. For example, the lighting of the colors would reflect whether the special area is inside, outside, during the day, at night, during a storm, so forth. In arbitrary color, the artist throws away all elements of the real world, and they impose their interpretation of the scene based on a mood or a feeling. For example, a face is rendered with a blue hue to represent sadness or depression. Arbitrary color is fantastic, where optical color is naturalistic and local color is idealistic. Tied up in all of this is a rhetorical model of artistic creativity in which publishers frame recoloring as, quote, updating colors or protecting artistic, quote, vision. Both of these rhetorical models call for us to problematize them. The idea of updating color is hard to find a parallel with. Would the publishers also update the pencils because the penciler's style had gone out of vogue? Or update the writing because it uses outmoded turns of phrase? If it were a matter of remastering color for new printing processes or digital display technologies, we could have that conversation. But frequently, updated color means totally different color, as we see in some of these examples from Marvel's reissue of the long out-of-print Miracle Man, or Marvel Man, depending on where the series was published. The other framing I often see invokes the buzzword vision. In the case of the Miracle Man recoloring, then Marvel editor-in-chief Axel Alonso went out of his way to describe how the original colors had, quote, hurt the finished product when the comic was printed in color for the first time. But, Alonso said, and I quote here again, through close collaboration with all the artists, we're proud to now present these stories in a manner that matches their creative vision. The problem with this statement goes right back to the beginning of this video, because it separates the colorist from any kind of visioning process, and also kind of implies that the colorist isn't an artist. The colorist here is instead framed as a laborer, rather than making a significant creative contribution. This seems extremely problematic to me, as most of what you'll see in a Marvel comic is color. Imagine if we said color shouldn't be incorporated into the vision of any other art form. As I've been talking here, I've had these slides playing to illustrate some of the key grounds on which we can interpret color, especially when we see recoloring at work. But, as I'm sure some viewers already knew, Marvel Man was originally published in black and white. While this was a cost consideration more so than a creative decision at the time, through the lens of differential media, all three versions have to generate vastly different effects. Even black and white has its own attendant materiality, and these impact the themes, tones, and emotions we decode from the comic. There is no such thing as an agnostic aspect of media materiality. Most of the examples I've given today are pretty explicit and overt, but it's useful to think just as much about subtle recolorings that hint at their production processes, or simply reproduce poorly with a different materiality. In the age of day-and-date publication, where print and digital version of comics come out at the same time, it seems interesting to me that there are contexts where we pay more for a print version, when the colors may be far muddier or darker on the page than on the screen? What exchanges are we making in the internal transaction to read content with one materiality rather than another? But maybe one thing we can say of the print product is that at least we know the only recoloring of those pages that happen will be chemical in nature. A copy stain, a fade. These are less radical alterations than someone potentially changing the color of the sky when you refresh the page. It's not about losing original purpose, as some retro purists might argue, and it's not about making the book look as sharp as possible, as some marketers might argue. It's all about exchanges. One last parting thought. One of the qualities of comics that led to an assessment of them as low art in the early days of their popularity was their mass production. Comics were grouped with all the other forms of mechanically reproduced art, essentially without aura. It strikes me that the grounds have shifted so much by this point that if we take Rugg's earlier commentary into account, every printed comic has its own uniqueness because we can now measure difference with electron microscope precision. And these alterations will speed up, not slow down. Even the title of my talk, Halftone Dots to LEDs, speaks to two arguably archaic terms in the world of coloring, printing, and displaying, because the technologies keep moving us somewhere else. Comics as an industry only relatively recently recognized the commercial value of reprinting, and even more recently realized that recoloring is a way to make reprints more collectible, to infuse them with a sense of prestige and remastering. But value judgments like this have nothing to do with it, and the rhetoric around it is deeply tied into thorny issues of churn and consumption. It may be helpful to also look at the differences and ask, how is that story then different? And which applies to my reading in what ways? I contend that it isn't just a matter of textual criticism.